All right, let's get straight into this explainer, but I do want to warn you right up front, we are unpacking some extremely heavy material today. We're going to be looking at the compounding waves of state-driven violence in Eastern Europe, specifically Ukraine, over three absolutely devastating decades. I'm talking from 1914 to 1945. This region saw a level of sustained, relentless terror that is honestly almost impossible for us to fully comprehend today.
And the crucial point here, and really this is how we have to approach this entire topic, is that statistics inherently depersonalize victims. It's just human nature. You see a number with six zeros, and your brain just can't process the grief. So to truly grasp this history, like historian Timothy Snyder points out, we have to imagine these vast numbers as individual lost loved ones. As we go through these numbers today, try to imagine every single digit as a sister, a brother, or a parent. I want you to picture a fragile little boat, desperately trying to navigate these turbulent, overwhelming waves. That was Ukraine between 1914 and 1945. It was a period where extreme geopolitical instability, constantly shifting borders, and warring factions basically turned the entire region into a tragic, real-world laboratory for modern mass murder. Let's actually map this out chronologically to see how it builds, because this didn't just happen overnight. We start with the spark of World War I in 1914, then move right through the Bolshevik Revolution, into the horrifying engineered famine of the Holodomor in the early 30s, and finally crest with the absolute devastation of World War II and the Holocaust. What we're tracking here is this dark evolution from spontaneous, angry riots into cold, institutionalized terror. Now, what's truly terrifying is how the actual nature of the violence evolved. See, on one hand, you had the early waves, which were bloody and terrific for sure, but they were often spontaneous mob violence or military reprisals during the First World War, kind of amateurish. But then, right around 1917, the Bolsheviks introduced something entirely new: cold, strategic, proactive terror. It wasn't just angry mobs anymore. It was violence explicitly engineered as a tool to achieve political goals. To really understand the scale of this, we've got to zoom in on specific micro-narratives of horror. Because the truth is, all local armies participated in these atrocities. For instance, in 1914 in Przemysl, a massacre was triggered simply when a soldier put a revolver to a 17-year-old girl's head and fired, leading to villagers being brutally beaten to death. Or in Preskurav, where an Orthodox priest named Father Kacharovsky literally ran out into the street to save a Jewish child from rioters. He shouted, "Christian people, what are you doing?" And they killed both him and the child right there on the spot. And the numbers escalate so quickly. Between 1,300 and 5,000 people were killed in just 3 days during the Red Terror in Kyiv in 1918. When the Bolsheviks took the city, anything could be a pretext for an immediate execution. I mean, simply having a bourgeois appearance, like literally if you didn't have enough calluses on your hands, or sporting a quote-unquote nationalist mustache, was a death sentence. It's just wild to even think about. As we move into the 1930s, the terror sharply shifts toward the peasantry. Enter the Holodomor, the deliberate, state-enforced starvation of Ukrainian peasants. Starvation is a uniquely agonizing way to die because it completely destroys internal village solidarity. It led to unimaginable moral anguish. Survivors actually recall that people were driven so incredibly mad by hunger that they resorted to cannibalism. It proves this really horrifying reality, that very, very few people possess a moral faith that's stronger than the sheer physical agony of the human body. Now, to understand the absolute finality of Soviet terror, we can actually look at a stark historical contrast right across the border in interwar Poland. The Ukrainian population there faced with a state called pacifications, brutal beatings, and the destruction of Orthodox churches. Don't get me wrong, it was deeply violent and disturbing. But here's the critical distinction. Roughly 90% of those arrested by Polish authorities were eventually acquitted. That kind of legal process or survival rate, absolutely unimaginable under the absolute finality of Soviet terror. And that brings us to the absolute peak of this terrible pyramid of violence. Between 1941 and 1944, approximately 1.5 million Jews died in Ukraine. This was the Holocaust, and that specific number represented 1 full quarter of the 6 million total Jewish victims of the Nazi regime. But the method here was so distinct from what we typically picture. Unlike the industrialized death camps built over in Western Europe, Ukraine essentially became a physical, open-air laboratory for what historians call the Holocaust by bullets. Victims were shot directly into pits. The Nazis even experimented with this horrific method they called sardine packing, where they layered bodies and dirt just to save space. In a lot of these villages, witnesses reported the completely horrifying sight of the ground continuing to move for days after the executions, simply because some people, especially children, had been buried alive. Meanwhile, out on the actual front lines of the war, it was an absolute meat grinder. We're talking an average of 27,300 casualties every single day during the Battle of the Dnieper. Soviet soldiers were pointlessly sent to their deaths by the tens of thousands. They were forced forward by their officers, but they couldn't retreat. Why? Because they were terrified of their own side. The Soviet NKVD executioners were lying in wait right behind their own trenches, ready to gun down absolutely anyone who fell back. Okay, so behind those front lines, things were arguably just as chaotic. You had a massive multifactional partisan war raging in places like Volhynia. You've got Soviet partisans, the Polish Home Army, and the Ukrainian insurgent army all fighting each other. In this kind of environment, the state completely loses its monopoly on violence. The lines between a regular peasant, a soldier, and a brutal executioner entirely blurred. And what results from that is an endless, vicious cycle of retaliation. Murder took on this terrifyingly intimate character. These weren't strangers dropping bombs from airplanes. These were neighbors literally killing neighbors. And they were often using common farm tools, sickles, scythes, axes. You'd have Ukrainian insurgents massacring a Polish village, the Polish Home Army brutally retaliating against a Ukrainian village, and Soviet partisans burning people alive. It was total, localized warfare. So take a step back for a second. How was this extreme scale of death even possible? We really have to shift our focus from what happened to why it happened. And a big part of the answer is the rise of what's called the spoiler state. In regimes like the USSR and Nazi Germany, violence wasn't just a tool used to maintain order. Violence became the very essence, the actual engine of the state itself. These states literally could not exist without systemic murder. This extreme violence wasn't just some throwback to ancient barbarism either. It was a dark, twisted evolution of modernity. There was a 19th century thinker who predicted that future tyranny would be like an ancient conqueror, Genghis Khan with a telegraph. Later on, Stalin was called Genghis Khan with a telephone, and Hitler, Genghis Khan with gas chambers. So it's ancient brutality, right? But mathematically amplified by modern industrial technology. But here's the thing. Technology alone isn't enough to make this happen. You need ideology. Both the Soviet and Nazi regimes justified these massive hecatombs of victims through their own millennial visions. It was this kind of beautiful madness. They genuinely claimed that a perfect new world, whether that was a global proletarian utopia on one side or total Aryan racial domination on the other, was just one final mass extermination away. They fully believed historical necessity was on their side. So, where does that leave us today? Well, after the war, and especially after the fall of communism, we've seen this really dangerous politics of memory pop up. Countries naturally want to create a convenient past. It's an egoistic, collective amnesia where nations fiercely highlight their own victimhood while deliberately ignoring or straight up covering up the times their own citizens participated in atrocities as criminals. The philosopher Albert Camus actually offers us the best alternative to this kind of amnesia, and that is moral honesty. He said, "We must aim not to be on the side of the executioners." True moral honesty requires us to stand in solidarity with all victims, regardless of their nationality. We have to recognize the hard truth that the executioners and the pure heroes were actually always in the minority. Most people were simply victims caught up in the waves. If a nation really wants to build a healthy future, it can't just build it entirely on victimhood or ideological martyrs. We need to look to heroes of simple, profound human decency. People like Father Omeliankiewicz. He was a Greek Catholic priest who managed to live under 5 different regimes. During the Holocaust, he actively, bravely saved Jews, which ultimately led to him being sent to the Majdanek concentration camp, where he eventually died. And this right here is what ultimate heroism looks like. When his family desperately tried to secure his release from the death camp, he wrote them a letter back, literally begging them to stop. He chose to stay. He wrote that in the camp everyone was finally equal. Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, Russians. He was the only priest there, and he chose to sacrifice his own life simply so he could stay and comfort the dying of all nationalities, helping them, as he put it, cross the bridge. So, in a century completely defined by unimaginable, industrialized state terror, how will we choose to remember history? Are we going to build a comfortable, convenient past?
Or will we find the courage to actually honor the humanity of every single individual who suffered? Think about that for a bit. And hey, thank you so much for joining us for this explainer.